Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll give it just 30 seconds or so to let folks trickle in, and then we will get started. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're just giving it a couple seconds for everyone to trickle in. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We will jump in and get started. My name is Sonal Jessel. I'm the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. We Act is a community-based organization based in West Harlem, and we have, since 1988, been working to build healthy communities. We've been doing that through organizing, policy, education work, and as well as environmental health research, which is the component that we're talking about today. We Act was started over a fight against a sewage treatment plant that was being placed in the west side of Harlem. What we know today is that communities of color and low income are frequently burdened with a number of environmental hazards in their community, which leads to health inequities. So whether that's sources from industrial facilities, cars, and what we're talking about today is the home, it's important that we're looking at policies and programs that can shift that burden that has been fallen on communities of color for far too long, and start addressing how we're building healthy communities in homes, especially in the context of us switching away from fossil fuels towards decarbonization and electrification of our buildings. We're here today to talk about the Out of Gas In with Justice report that we published just a couple weeks ago. And this was a 2-year-long effort to document the impacts of switching away from gas stoves to electric stoves, specifically in affordable housing. So Out of Gas In with Justice is a pilot project. We were focusing on how switching from a gas stove, fossil fuel gas stove, towards an electric induction stove can both improve air quality and also how that can change the behaviors of tenants in place, particularly in a public housing setting. We were really interested to look at how do people that have not yet been part of the process of studying electrification, how can they be involved? How do people feel about these kinds of changes in their buildings and in their homes? Do they like it? How do we make sure that people know how to cook on these kinds of stoves? There was a lot of questions we were looking to get answered, along with our core study around the air quality impacts of moving away from a fossil fuel emissions appliance. We conducted this study at Watson Houses in New York City's Housing Authority in NYCHA, and that is a building up in the Bronx. We did this in partnership with Association for Energy Affordability, with RMI, Berkeley Air Monitoring, Columbia, and we also have been doing this in partnership with Push Buffalo, that is working on a parallel study looking at the same question in Buffalo, New York. The reason why we decided to work on this study to begin with is that We Act is really centered in the idea that everyone deserves a healthy home. For us, that means not only a home free of mold and lead and asbestos, but it's also a home where people are able to spend time comfortably, both when it comes to their heating, their cooling, and other energy needs that they have, like being able to have preserved food in their refrigerator, being able to run their machines that they might need that are important for their health. So how do we make sure that folks have a holistically healthy home in all elements of what that means? So that is all the way from basic housing security to having an efficient and healthy home when it comes to air quality. This is a really important topic today because, as most of you know, we are in a major point of change in the US and especially in New York, where we're thinking about how are we reducing are emissions from buildings. And what we act is really working to make sure that we're doing is interjecting and make sure that we're centering the idea of health and local benefits for residents of diverse backgrounds and demographics. The main motivations for doing this study is that, as we know, 70% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. So it is really, really a big focus for We Act and a lot of groups in New York City and the city itself and the state to be focusing on how we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. What's really important piece of this is that we're looking at co-pollutants and we're looking at that indoor air quality benefit. We believe that if we are addressing air quality issues in homes, addressing other environmental hazard issues like mold, then we are also getting at the solutions for climate change, but really doing it where we're focused on how do we make sure tenants are safe and healthy. We also know that air pollution from buildings lead to 2,000 premature deaths each year across New York State. And we know that 10% of the population currently has asthma, which is what we find to be a result of air pollution issues, both inside the home and as a result of air quality outside of the home. And we know that a lot of childhood asthma is actually now attributable to the use of gas stoves in homes. Lastly, I'll say in New York City, this is especially important, and it's even more important in the Bronx specifically, because New York City has a really high rate of childhood asthma. In particular, it's low-income children, children of color living in communities across New York City, like the South Bronx, that are 3 times more likely to be hospitalized for asthma. And we know that actually asthma is one of the top contributors to children missing school days, which, as we all know, has long-term implications on their livelihood and well-beings. So this study was really important because we're not only looking at how do we focus on decarbonization and electrification in lower income buildings in New York City amongst a diverse population of people, but how are we delivering these really tangible and life impacting health benefits to people to improve their daily lives. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Annie Carfero, our Climate Justice Campaigns Manager, to talk about our pilot.
Thank you so much, Sonal, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to give you kind of a deep dive preview into our pilot, what we did, the results we found, and what that means for our policy advocacy moving forward. So I'm going to jump right in. And again, please leave any questions that you have. I think the chat may be disabled, so you can leave them in the Q&A and we'll get to answer them at the end. So the Out of Gas and with Justice pilot, we reported the health and social impacts of transitioning from gas to induction stoves using 3 main tests. Our first was long-term kitchen air monitoring. So we did a week-long air monitoring in residents' homes 3 separate times over a 6-month period, collecting 24-hour daily data. We also ran what's called the controlled cooking test, which is a scientifically valid and repeatable protocol. We cooked the same meal, spaghetti, broccoli, and cookies, controlling for variables like the food quantity, the recipe, the cooking conditions on both a gas stove and an induction stove, and we monitored air quality throughout those cooking tests. And then we also conducted stove usability focus groups to hear from participants about their experiences with gas stoves, with the new induction stoves, and the transition process. Next slide. So the long-term air monitoring, you can see here, the picture on the right is the home health box that we installed in people's homes for a week at a time. It was about the size of a lunchbox. It ran completely silent, and it was capturing nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide data in real time. We wanted to measure these 2 air pollutants specifically because of their impacts on people's health. Nitrogen dioxide is a particularly damaging one because it contributes to respiratory illnesses and can exacerbate conditions like asthma. Next slide. This is where, at the very beginning of the pilot, we actually ran into one of our first challenges, and this was due to building limitations. So Participants that were receiving an induction stove also needed to receive some modifications to their apartment so that they could handle that new electrical capacity. We had to install a double pole 40 amp breaker, as well as a 209 to 220 volt outlet in the kitchen, which you normally don't have those types of outlets in kitchens. They're typically reserved in the living room for an air conditioner. We had an electrician come and do an assessment of the building, and he found that Watson Avenue had an electrical capacity limitation that prohibited us from installing more than 2 stoves on a line. So there are six stories in Watson Avenue. And 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and 6G are all fed by a common wire. And we ran the risk, if we installed more than 2 stoves, of actually creating a power outage or an electrical overload. So this is something that we'll talk about towards the end when we talk about our findings and lessons learned, but was an initial limitation in recruitment of participants. Next slide. Another limitation that's worth mentioning at the beginning is just the study sample size. So this is really helping us evaluate the impacts of gas stoves on indoor air quality for affordable housing residents, but we did only have 20 households participating, and so fluctuations or oddities in the air quality could have an impact on the results. This is part of the reason we're really excited that Push Buffalo is doing a sister pilot up in Buffalo, because that will be able to eventually, after their data is collected, kind of expand the pool, our sample size. Next slide. So what were the results from our long-term air monitoring? When looking at nitrogen dioxide, we found that households with induction stoves experienced a 35% reduction in their daily nitrogen dioxide concentrations compared to households with gas stoves, which is significant. And in this analysis, we controlled for temperature and apartment level factors, because we wanted to take into account that we were taking measurements throughout different seasons. Our air monitoring ranged from October to June. So people's windows might have been opened, and that can influence concentrations. And so we put some basic controls on, but we still found that there was a 35% reduction in daily NO2. Next slide. When we look at carbon monoxide, we found that 24-hour averages of carbon monoxide for households with gas stoves were averaged around concentrations of 1.4 parts per million, where households with the induction stove had a 24-hour average of 0.8 parts per million, which is a significant decrease. And I mentioned the health impacts of nitrogen dioxide, but carbon monoxide exposure can exacerbate cardiovascular illnesses and even low concentrations. And so this is important that we're seeing this decrease when we take out the gas stove. Next slide. So we wanted to do an analysis of what these numbers meant for people's health. Because again, we were looking at the health benefits of switching from gas to induction. And so to better understand this, we looked at specifically for nitrogen dioxide, we looked at how the reduced daily NO2 concentrations in each household We wanted to look at how the reduced daily NO2 concentrations in each household benefited people's health. And so we used 2 thresholds. We used the WHO, the World Health Organization's 24-hour indoor air quality guideline, and the EPA's air quality index, which is what you're looking at right now. So an important thing to note is that the EPA does not have indoor air quality guidelines. This air quality index is actually for outdoor exposure limits. And so what we decided to look at is when indoor air quality transitioned from good to moderate, which could impact sensitive groups like young children, older adults, or people with respiratory illnesses. And again, we were looking at when air quality inside of people's homes actually exceeded what is considered acceptable outside. Next slide. So this is gonna fill in, so I just wanted to explain it because this chart can be a little bit hard to adjust to. But we looked at the percent of monitored hours in each household spent in each category of NO2 exposure. So we see the WHO's 24-hour indoor air quality guideline, which is 13 parts per billion for a 24-hour period in green. And then we looked at the EPA's air quality index 1 hour outdoor NO2 exposure, which is when air quality transitions from good to moderate. And that is at 54 parts per billion, and that is in red. And then all 1 hour averages that are between 13 and 54 are illustrated in yellow. And so we mapped this, we graphed this for baseline air measurements when everybody had their gas stove. And then in the follow-up air monitoring periods, when half of the households received their induction stove and the other half maintained their gas stove. Next slide. So what did we find? We saw that NO2 concentrations were higher for both our control and intervention groups during baseline. And this makes sense just based seasonally. So our measurements were taken for the baseline air monitoring between October and February. And this is times when the basement boiler in the building is more active. People are more likely to have their windows closed, which can increase concentrations. And during baseline air monitoring, we were also recording some cooking events that were 18 hours. And then in subsequent interviews with participants, we confirmed that some participants were actually using their ovens to heat their apartments. And so we were seeing really high concentrations of NO2 in both apartments, as you can see in the top line of this graph, where it's red. Again, that's where air quality is over what is acceptable for outdoor air quality. And for 1 hour periods. So this is showing that some households had indoor air quality that exceeded outdoor standards for much more than an hour. Next slide. But what we do see in the follow-up period, which this air monitoring ranged from May to July, we saw that when you remove the gas stove, 1 hour averages exceeding this 54 ppb threshold, which is again the EPA's standard for good to moderate exposure for outdoor air quality. Those types of exposures are virtually eliminated when the intervention group received their induction stove. However, we do still see a lot of yellow. You do still see nitrogen dioxide concentrations that are above what the World Health Organization considers acceptable for indoor exposure. And so this led us to kind of identify another limitation in our study, which we can go to the next slide, which is that we were seeing interference from other nitrogen dioxide sources besides the stove. So that could be again, like I mentioned, the basement boiler. This building is 96 units and they have one central boiler in the basement. So that boiler is working and it is producing nitrogen dioxide in the process. Also, cars outside can contribute to indoor air quality and gas stoves in other apartments. So we have to remember we only transitioned at the very beginning, 10 apartments went from gas to induction. And so the other 86 units in that building still had their gas stoves, and that can impact our daily readings. So these, what we call confounders or potential sources of air pollution, was an important discovery in our air monitoring because it highlights the limitations of individual interventions in apartments, especially in a dense urban area like New York City. Next slide. So this led us to do what is called the controlled cooking test. And this was because we were picking up other sources of nitrogen dioxide. We really wanted to isolate the stove and understand the impact on air quality the gas stove was having versus the induction stove. And so again, like I mentioned, the controlled cooking test, it allows researchers to compare air quality between cooking on gas versus induction while controlling for lots of different factors. And I included a little screenshot of our chart that we actually used while we were running these controlled cooking tests. We weighed out the food, we made sure that we used identical pots and pans. We made sure we used the identical temperatures in different apartments when we were cooking this meal. The only difference was the stove. And so we did this test 17 times. We were supposed to do 18, but one participant had COVID on their last test. And so we ended up only doing 17. But we did this in 3 households with gas stoves and 3 households with induction stoves. And what we found was that we measured, our findings were pretty startling. So I'll explain this very quickly. What we did at the beginning of the controlled cooking test was before we started cooking, we would take baseline NO2. So we would turn on our air monitoring machines and we would just measure what the NO2 was in the apartment before we even turned the stove on. And we did that for 5 minutes in every household. So if you're looking at the box plot on the right, you'll see background for gas and induction. That was kind of our baseline NO2. And then we started the controlled cooking test. And so we found that with homes with gas stoves, when we started cooking, NO2 shot up from an average of 18 parts per billion to 197 parts per billion in the controlled cooking test. And in some homes that was higher. So 197 parts per billion is actually the average. We were seeing some levels that were higher. Meanwhile, when you look at the induction households, you see really no difference between background and cooking. When we did these measurements, we actually found that NO2 went up by 190%. Households with gas stoves were 190%, had NO2 concentrations that were 190% higher than households with induction stoves. And sorry, Sona, do you mind going back to that other slide? If you look at the box plot, you can actually see we put markers from the EPA's air quality index for unhealthy for sensitive groups, which is above moderate, and unhealthy for all groups. And we were seeing that NO2 concentrations inside of people's homes was sometimes in homes with gas stoves exceeding what was considered unhealthy for all groups for outdoor exposure. So this was very concerning for us. And now we can go to the next slide. This is kind of just a screenshot to show you. This is one cooking test from a house with a gas stove compared to one cooking test with from a house with an induction stove. One of the benefits actually of cooking on the induction stove was the meal cooked a lot faster. The water boiled a lot quicker, everything kind of just moved faster. So we tried to find 2 cooking tests where the times were as similar as possible. And what we saw when we, again, used the EPA's threshold for unhealthy for sensitive groups, which is, again, younger children, older adults, or people with respiratory illnesses, which is a majority of the participants in our study, we found that 43 of the 45 minutes of cooking, nitrogen dioxide concentrations were above what is considered unhealthy for sensitive groups for outdoor exposure. Again, inside of people's kitchens. So our last test that we ran were the stove usability focus groups. And this was probably one of my favorite parts of the pilot, and I think one of many people's favorite parts of the pilot. We wanted to assess attitudes and opinions of gas stoves, induction stoves in the transition process. And our results were pretty unanimous. Participants loved their new induction stoves, and they cited reasons beyond health. So they cited reasons like the ease of cooking on it, time saving, because one, the induction stove cooks much faster. We heard many people talk about how Thanksgiving dinner was a lot easier to cook this year because they had their induction stove. Also, because it's a glass top, it's much easier to clean, which folks, especially those with disabilities, says was a huge benefit. They also felt like they decreased their reliance on other appliances. Many of them said they no longer use their air fryer because their oven actually could serve as an air fryer. And they also felt a sense of safety. That was a really underappreciated benefit of not having to burn gas inside their homes, whether, from a fire hazard stance or just like a health stance of like not breathing in these pollutants. We ended up giving all 20 households at the end of our study an induction stove, and not a single participant that received the stove actually asked for their gas stove back at the end of the study, which we did pose as an option. Which is really encouraging to show that induction stoves can be a viable option when we're thinking about transitioning low-income households off of gas ranges. Next slide. So that was kind of a brief run through of our results. And again, if you're interested in any piece of this, all of this is outlined in much more detail in the report. And we're also happy to answer questions you might have. But I want to go over some of the, important lessons learned or major takeaways, including, just from our experiences with some of the challenges and limitations that we ran into throughout the study. So we found that cooking with gas stoves results in acute indoor nitrogen dioxide concentrations that are harmful to health, particularly for sensitive groups. And again, like I said, in our study, the majority of our households had a permanent resident that was either a young child, who was an older adult, or who had a respiratory illness, or both. We also found that due to these confounders of nitrogen dioxide that were interfering with our results, one-to-one appliance exchanges for gas to induction stoves in multifamily housing, it will improve the indoor air quality for that unit. However, these other sources of pollution will continue to impact air quality. And so it really pushed us to start focusing on transitioning entire buildings, because that's going to have the greatest impact on public health. We also felt that there needs to be a more diverse public relations campaign for induction cooking and building electrification at large, because we saw in our study, most of our participants, I think one of our participants had ever heard of an induction stove, the rest had never heard of them. And when they were offered and had the opportunity to actually cook on one and use one, they loved it. And as I said, it is a really viable option for solving some of these air and housing quality issues that public housing residents are facing. Another lesson learned is that we know that low-income communities across New York State typically live in older housing that has structural deficiencies, deferred maintenance, health and safety issues, and they are going, like, we don't want to lie, this is not going to be cheap. They need significant investments to reach the electrification starting line. And when we're talking about multifamily buildings and specifically low-income tenants, we need to have more robust tenant protections in New York State to make sure that these investments are not displacing the populations that we are working to help. And then lastly, on our analysis of government programs, they're very siloed, and we need to see government programs packaging interventions for whole building retrofits so that people can maximize these benefits to residents' health. And expand the resources for this transition away from gas. Next slide. So we took all of our results, all of our lessons learned, challenges and limitations, and we organized them into some next steps or some policy implications that we kind of organized into 4 buckets, which I'm going to break down in the next part of this presentation. The next slide. So our first kind of policy bucket is the need to restructure existing programs to focus on whole home retrofits that prioritize low-income housing. So we see that states need to create pre-weatherization programs that can act as an automatic referral for households that have health and safety issues. So if you're dealing with mold or lead or asbestos in your home, you're often disqualified from participating in energy efficiency programs until you address those issues. But there's no program to help you address those issues. And those are the housing conditions that low-income people are most likely to live in. And so there needs to be more dedicated resources to helping people handle those housing quality concerns. We also need to, like we said, streamline access to benefits to increase participation in whole home electrification. If a landlord needs to apply to 6 different programs to tackle 6 different pieces of the electrification process, they're a lot less likely to continue to participate than if they can kind of access a lot of resources or multiple steps all at once. We also need to see programs tier their financial assistance so that we're reaching deeper levels of affordability. And then we also need to see programs, especially from our federal government, that are going to help support multifamily building owners, because that is a population that we think is going to be a little bit harder to target. And so we need to make sure that we're directing resources in their direction. Next slide. So we have some immediate next steps that we think can address parts of this problem. We have more in the report, but I did want to just highlight these 2 in specific, which is the Energy Efficiency, Equity, and Jobs Act. And this is a New York State bill. And this would help, this would allow New York State NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to fund non-energy measures to address underlying conditions like lead, like mold, asbestos, et cetera, that might prohibit an apartment from moving forward with an energy efficiency upgrade. So basically expanding the role of NYSERDA to cover health and safety concerns, so that way households with low-income tenants are not disqualified from the energy efficiency programs the agency offers. We also partner this with the GAP Fund, which would provide funds to help low to moderate income households electrify, and would also it would fill holes, and it would let people use these funds a little bit more be a little bit more flexible. And also use some of this money to address, health and safety concerns, electrical upgrades, like one of the issues that we ran into, mechanical system upgrades, et cetera. So these, again, are two pieces of legislation that we are advocating for actively to be included in the New York State budget in 2023. The next kind of policy bucket is adjusting policies and programs to meet the needs of low-income renters who have limited autonomy over housing conditions. So I don't know if folks have heard about this concept of the split incentive, but this is very prevalent, especially in New York City's housing market, where 70% of people are renters, where landlords or building owners have little incentive to invest in energy efficiency programs or weatherization programs because they're not going to feel the direct benefit. Meanwhile, the tenants that live in that building who have the most to gain don't have the autonomy or power to make these investments themselves. And so we have a couple of suggestions, general suggestions, amending existing weatherization and electrification programs so that there are interventions available for renters who can apply without landlord approval to make certain modifications to their unit. We also need to see robust tenant protections. It's critical to recognize that equitable building electrification for low-income renters is impossible without tenant protections, because unregulated tenants that live in the private market are vulnerable to instability and displacement, especially if landlords do start taking advantage of these public programs and making large-scale investments in their buildings. We've seen it before and we'll see it again. If there are not tenant protections in place, many low-income renters will get displaced as their landlords start to more seriously invest in their buildings. And then we also saw a real need to address our energy system, because we know that low-income households and households of color have experienced disproportionately high energy burdens, and while simultaneously facing worse outdoor and indoor air quality. And so the commodification of energy has really led to this disproportionate harm on low-income communities. And so we at We Act envision an energy system that is controlled publicly. It is controlled by the public. It is democratically accountable. And there's evidence that public utilities can help lower energy costs and also tend to adopt more large-scale renewable energy. And so this is, a really critical piece of decarbonization and something that we believe needs to happen to help buildings get off of fossil fuels. So some immediate next steps, and again, these are things that we are advocating for in New York State right now, is good cause eviction. So good cause eviction would give every tenant in New York State, every unregulated tenant in New York State, the right to a lease renewal, as well as protection against unreasonable rent increases. This is a really important bill, and it would give the much needed stability to present unjust real estate speculation in low-income neighborhoods, but also this displacement that could come from these investments in buildings. And so, we see this as kind of the floor when it comes to robust tenant protections, but we need to pass this legislation in Albany this year. We also are supporting Build Public Renewables, which would allow the New York Power Authority to have the ability to own and build new renewable energy projects, including the generation, storage, and transmission of renewables. We see this as an important first step in developing a public utility in New York State. And then we want to see better use of the Inflation Reduction Act funding. So right now we are seeing a tax credit system that's outlined in the IRA, and that will disqualify a lot of low-income renters from maximizing electrification credits. So we would like to see the development of a reimbursement or a refund program instead of a tax credit program, because that will open up access to lower income residents. Next slide. All right, last two buckets, so stay with me, and then we're going to open it up for questions. The third bucket is accelerating decarbonization in HUD-funded housing. So our study did take place in public housing. In New York City, the New York City Housing Authority has a very robust plan to electrify their existing building stock, but that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a financial challenge, and it's just going to be a research challenge. And so we want to remove as many bureaucratic barriers as possible to allow HUD-funded housing to use multiple different funding sources and stack and braid those sources to kind of get this work done. And we also need HUD to develop and deliver training to public housing authorities across the country on how to integrate these various funding sources so that we can achieve these decarbonization goals. We also encourage the use of something called resource efficient electrification for public housing, because we know that these capital budgets are stretched thin, and resource efficient electrification is an incremental methodology that combines an integrated design process with strategic capital planning for whole home retrofits. So that can help building owners make progress towards electrification and towards realizing safe, healthy, and climate-friendly living environments, while maintaining flexibility as technology and policies evolve. So this is basically, setting HUD up for success so that the next time a boiler breaks in a building or a gas line needs to be replaced, the building is in a position where it does not have to replace that gas or that fossil fuel infrastructure, and it can actually move towards electrification. That being said, our work in NYCHA, we did see people cooking on stoves that were 30 plus years old. And so we do believe that HUD should adopt a mandate to replace all existing gas stoves in HUD-funded housing and switch them to electric induction stoves by 2026. And then our final policy bucket is just to speed the transition to get off of fossil fuels and help make homes healthier. So we want, especially in New York State, to end subsidies for fossil fuels. We can do that by passing laws like the New York Heat Act, which will end a really archaic law in New York State that requires gas utilities to offer free hookups to any building that's within 100 feet of a gas main. This is quietly incentivizing buildings to hook up to gas, and that needs to end. We also want to see the Environmental Protection Agency set indoor air quality guidelines. It is a little bit crazy that we don't have those in the United States, especially when we're seeing that indoor air quality with a gas stove is exceeding what the EPA says is acceptable for outdoor exposure. And so we need to see indoor air quality guidelines, especially based on the current body of evidence of the health outcomes of being exposed to this type of indoor air pollution. And then finally, we want to commit to laws that are going to help accelerate green building and the green building economy, such as the All Electric Building Act, which would require buildings, new construction in New York State to be all electric. And this will really help kind of speed up and accelerate the process of developing new technologies that can be more affordable to help existing buildings transition off of gas. So that is a little sneak preview into our pilot. Thank you so much for listening, and we are going to open it up to questions. So I will pass it to Jen.
Great, thank you, Annie. So we have a question from Rob asking about why induction versus other kinds of electric stoves.
I can take that one. It's a great question. So we ultimately decided to go with induction stoves just because of the quality of the cook. So standard electric stoves, they're the ones that kind of, you might have seen like a coil, or now they do have glass tops, but they heat a burner and some of that heat is transferred to the pot on top, but a lot of that heat is still lost into the surrounding air, where induction stoves are actually using electricity. So one of the caveats of an induction stove is that you have to have a magnetic pot. We provided all of our participants with a brand new cookware set of induction ready pots and pans. And in our policy recommendations in the full report, you will see that we see this as a requirement when you're working with low to moderate income households. You need to provide that induction ready cookware because that is too much of a cost burden for people who are on fixed income or low income. But when you have a magnetic pan and you put it on the induction stove, it produces a magnetic current that passes through the pot and pans themselves. So it's very efficient. So you're basically not losing any heat to the outside air. And so this has a lot of benefits. One, it causes the pan to heat up very quickly and it cooks food incredibly fast, we were seeing pasta water boil in about 4 minutes, which is impressive. It keeps the surrounding cooktop cool. So the only thing that's hot is the pot and the part of the stove directly underneath the pot. And so that's a huge benefit, safety benefit, especially if you have young children or pets or whatever that may be. So we ultimately went with induction again, because it's more efficient, because it cooks food faster, and because the quality of the cook is a lot better. And I would say that our focus group supported that the induction stove transition was really easy because people really enjoyed and had fun cooking on their stoves.
Great, thanks, Annie. And we had one participant, Lewis, also commenting on the increased safety of the induction stove compared to electric coils that can get hotter. So we had a couple questions in the chat about doing a cost comparison of utility bills. So looking at switching from gas over to induction. So I can speak to that a little bit. We did a kind of like preliminary analysis looking at over the duration of the monitoring period, what would be the monthly utility bills when switching from a gas to induction stove. So we found that for households that were still connected to their gas line and paying that kind of like base fee for gas, the increase overall per month would be about $6 a month to transition from gas to induction cooking. Looking at about using the same cooking rates or times as someone would with the gas stove. But we found that for a household that fully transitioned over to electric away from gas entirely and disconnected from their gas bill, they would actually save about $11 a month. So we're finding that there's a small cost increase when you're still connected to gas, but a cost savings overall if you fully transitioned away from gas. And I think just one other piece of that question that Annie, maybe you could answer. Someone asked if there are ways to make sure that as electrification takes place, residents' bills are kept at affordable levels. So that might speak more to the policy side.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that's really important to us at We Act, and we've been pushing for a very long time to a commitment that was made by the former governor of New York State that said that energy bills for all people should be capped at 6% of people's income. We did not see that promise realized, but that's something that we keep in the forefront of our advocacy and do try and integrate into different pieces of legislation to make sure that we are keeping costs down. We do also, as we are transitioning to renewable resources, we do expect to see the cost of energy decrease. Oops, sorry. Sorry, everybody. The negatives of living in an apartment. And another, but in the interim, what we want to see is energy affordability programs that are, that private utilities contribute. Sonal, do you want to take this? I'm sorry.
Yes, though I'm also in a bit of a loud apartment. Can we repeat the question, please, and then I'll take it from there.
Yes. So the question was about energy affordability and making sure that tenants are protected and there's affordability measures.
Okay, from the policy side. Yeah, so, that is really important. And that's also why we wanted to be studying this in affordable housing. With NYCHA, of course, a lot of residents don't pay their energy bills, which did make it easier to work on this study while we don't have as many protections that we need. But that is why on the policy side, we as an organization do push to codify the promise that Governor Hochul made that no one would be burdened with energy bills beyond 6% of their income, which is called the energy burden. And then also that's why we push for bills for laws like good cause eviction, because it's important that as homes are upgrading, as there might be fancier appliances and healthier homes, that having a good quality home doesn't mean that you're going to get displaced, doesn't mean that the landlord is able to raise rents beyond a very small percentage and displace for any reason connected to the upgrades of their buildings. So that's some of the stuff that we're working towards. And We also believe that building out public renewables, building out renewables in general, as is outlined in a lot of research in the state scoping plan, that will also help over time be reducing electricity bills. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in parallel to the work being done directly in the study around switching out the gas stoves to induction stove. There's a lot of other policies we're working on to help with that bill cost and eventually make that really affordable for folks.
Great, thank you, Sonal. And we had a couple more policy related questions that maybe you could take, or Annie. One is from Ren. And Ren said, will you all be able to tap IRA funding to help get more induction stoves in low income housing?
Yeah, I can start and Annie add on. Yes, so there are a couple of funds identified in the IRA that's really meant for homes, meant for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in housing. We think that the induction stoves, add induction stoves to programs will be really important and is a really massive opportunity we have this year that we haven't had in the past. The GAP fund that Annie explained also does recommend pulling funding from the IRA. So that would be a new funding program that would exist in the state. And we would want the money to come from the IRA, for example. There's some buckets as well, but that is a big opportunity. We're also think that the IRA will be helping bring down the cost of these appliances. That will be really helpful. And one thing that we're very much focused on is how do we make sure that the funding for IRA is also helping really low income populations, because things like tax credits often don't end up being as helpful as a direct subsidy or a program upfront that will help with those heavy costs to start with. So there's a lot there, but that's just a general answer.
Thank you, Sonal. And I think one last question on the policy side from Emily. Emily said, I think this was touched on a bit, but once landlords are incentivized to make these upgrades, the homes become more desirable, causing the unregulated rental market to run rampant, what we're seeing in so many places. How can we ensure that folks aren't displaced because of these upgrades?
Yeah, I can take that one. So this is something that's really important, again, to WeAct, because we represent an area that has been kind of a hotbed for real estate speculation and displacement. And we know that as we're calling for these improvements to apartments, we don't want to see exactly what you're saying, which is people getting displaced from their homes. And so in New York specifically, we have been calling for the good cause eviction, which is a statewide bill. And this would basically, it would give unregulated tenants. So there are some protections, especially for people who live in HUD-funded housing against rent increases and evictions. There's also in New York City, we have a rent stabilization program that does keep certain buildings that are within that realm. It keeps their rents from, increasing astronomically and causing displacement. But we also have a lot of unregulated housing across New York City and New York State. And so good cause eviction would be this added kind of layer of regulation. It would first off give every tenant in New York State the right to a lease renewal unless they have broken their lease. And so that's what it means by good cause eviction. You can only get evicted for good cause. You can't get evicted because the landlord wants to charge $900 more in your apartment. It would prevent huge rent hikes that could cause displacement. It would tie it to something called the Consumer Price Index, which is about a 6 to 7% or 7 to 8% increase year over year, which is still a lot, but it is definitely better than what we're seeing in some apartments in New York City, where people are seeing 200% increases in their rent year over year as the real estate becomes more valuable. So good cause eviction is really important. And there's another element to this just on top of rent increases, that it would prohibit rent increases that could displace people. It can also change the landlord tenant dynamic in the sense that if a tenant knows that they can't get evicted for speaking up to their landlord, that they can only get evicted if they break their lease, or if they do something that, in their lease is not allowed, they can demand better living conditions. They can demand that landlords take care of deferred maintenance issues that they might have been neglecting for years, or they can push them to be involved in more of these electrification programs. And so we see it as a necessary step to keep people in their homes, but also to give tenants a little bit more rights over the conditions that they live in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Annie. And now we have some questions more on the monitoring side. So one from Anshul asking, did you take CO2 measurements? And then Anshul commented that in unscientific readings from their kitchen, noticed a reduction from 1,100 ppm gas to 550 ppm for radiant electric, and is noting CO2 levels persistently above 1,000 ppm can be generally unhealthy and interfere with alertness.
So I can jump in again. We did take CO2 measurements during the controlled cooking test. So we were using some really sensitive air monitoring equipment that was measuring nitrogen dioxide, and then another machine that was measuring carbon dioxide and methane. Yes. And we unfortunately didn't have that time to analyze that data for the report, but we are considering submitting the data that we collected to future papers. And so we can keep everybody informed, but we would be doing more analysis on some of that air quality data that we collected during the controlled cooking test specifically.
Perfect. And we have a question from Rebecca asking, did you inform participants of the unsafe levels of NO2? If you did, how did they respond to this information?
Yeah, so we wanted to be very transparent with the data that we were collecting. And so whatever we shared publicly with everyone here, we shared with participants. And the benefit is that folks that participated in our pilot, 19 out of 20 of them did receive the induction stove. We unfortunately could not give the induction stove to one participant because she had a pacemaker, and there is a very, very small, but nonetheless a risk that the magnetic field on the induction stove could interfere with her pacemaker. And so out of an abundance of caution, we did not provide her the stove. But the benefit is that 19 of the 20 households we did do this air monitoring in received induction stoves, and no longer have that gas stove that's contributing to really high concentrations of nitrogen dioxide. For the participant that didn't receive the stove, and also just for general knowledge for our participants to share with family and friends that still have their gas stoves, we shared general facts about ways to keep yourself safe with a gas stove. If you do have a vent hood, a range hood, to use that for ventilation, to open your windows when you're cooking as much as possible, to, under no circumstances use your stove to heat your apartment. That was a really big one that we wanted to let people know, because we did record evidence of that. And then also just the reality that, we need, a lot of people feel that they don't feel safe with their gas stove and want to transition to induction. And so letting them know that we are doing the work to make that more accessible for people. And that's not a quick and easy answer, but it is something that we are really committed to.
Thanks, Annie. And we have a question from Brittany asking, did the people that got a stove use gas for their other energy needs, such as water heating, etc.? And did you look at the impact of those things on their health?
Sorry, Jen, can you just repeat that question?
Yes. So Brittany asked, did the people that got a stove use gas for their other energy needs, such as water heating, etc.? And did you look at the impact of those things on their health?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think did we record participants using their gas stove for other energy needs besides cooking? The one that we did notice, like I've mentioned a couple of times, is heating apartments. I'm not sure about water heating. The induction stove can heat, it can heat water in the same way, but what we did really want to encourage folks is to let their family and friends know, even though buildings do not have adequate heating, which is again an issue of older housing with structural deficiencies that we see low income folks more frequently living in, that using the stove for heat can really lead to some pretty detrimental indoor air quality. And so we did really encourage folks to, kind of spread the awareness to not do that anymore.
Great, thank you, Annie. So we have a question from Joelle asking, if everyone can only cook on electric, what happens when the power goes out? When the power goes out, I'm always grateful to have a gas stove. And two, I understand that indoor air quality suffers. However, do we consider alternatives to electrification? For example, better ventilation or capturing naturally occurring methane instead of fossil fuels? And I think you, Anne, you were going to take that one.
Yeah, I think that that is a very valid question, and I think a question and concern that is shared very often when we're talking about electrification. I think in this case, we need to remember that this is going to be a transition. It's not like an instant thing where, your home is suddenly just transitioned to all electric with no other safeguards, because it's exactly a situation like this that we want to avoid. So I think to that piece, we recognize that there is a lot of pre and complementary work that needs to be done in addition to electrification. So whether that is battery storage, whether that is, increasing energy efficiency so that we don't see this kind of, full on demand on the grid that would cause power outages, and other such resilience measures to make sure that residents are not caught out in an emergency situation where there aren't any other backup measures that they can use to be safe and healthy. Because I think there is this recognition that, that does happen to be a measure that folks do rely on in the case of power outages. But that isn't really something that we need, that prevents us from transitioning. And instead, we need to be thinking about what are all of these other safeguards that we can put in place in order to, really make sure that this transition is accessible for everybody, while ensuring that it's safe and healthy always, no matter the circumstance.
Great, thank you, Yuan. And then we have a question from Kevin asking, were the CO levels unsafe for health? I'm not sure when CO levels start to become dangerous and cause illness. There was a notable increase in the figures shared.
I can jump in here. So even low levels of carbon monoxide exposure can be damaging to your health, especially over long periods of time. And so we did measure a significant decrease in the amount of carbon monoxide that people were exposed to inside their homes when we took the gas stoves out. That being said, it is a good question, and the levels of carbon monoxide that we measured were still under what is considered like what a 24-hour guideline would suggest, which I don't unfortunately have that number in my head at the top of my head, but it's around, I believe, 3 parts per million. And we can look that up definitely and share that. But it was, even with the gas stove, it was under that level, which is good. But this is an air pollutant that the more exposure you have to it, it is going to harm your health. And so if you can reduce that exposure as much as possible, that's going to be the best option.
Perfect, Annie, thank you. And I think that about wraps up our questions for today. So if Annie, you want to close everyone out?
Yeah, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This was actually very well timed. And thank you for your questions. And, we're always happy to continue to talk about the results. We're working with many of you on this call on the advocacy to make, whole home retrofits more accessible for everybody across New York, across the country, especially those who are in low-income communities and who are people of color. And so the work continues. This is kind of like the start, and we really hope to implement some of our lessons learned and make them into effective policy. And so we hope to get to work with, each and every one of you to make that a reality. I will drop my email in the chat. If you are interested in talking more about this, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we can always, continue the conversation. Thank you very much.